It's now time for Chapter 10 of Radiating Literature. This is the last time I can actually do the number thing, and I'm posting things, I think, too close together for people to have actually voted on whether I should do the numbers, but I can't do more than 10, so it'll continue to be Radiating Literature. Again, I've decided I'm pronouncing this name Gabrielle Stoner. That's probably not how it's said, but that's just how it's gonna be. Okay, Chapter 10, Gabrielle Stoner. The man who entered the room was a striking figure. Very tall, with a well-knit athletic frame and a deeply bronzed face and neck, he dominated the assembly. Even Gerard seemed anemic beside him. When I knew him better, I realized that Gabrielle Stoner was quite an unusual personality. English by birth, he had knocked about all over the world. He had shot big game in Africa, traveled in Korea, ranched in California, and traded in the South Sea Islands. He had been secretary to a New York railway magnate and had spent a year encamped in the desert with a friendly tribe of Arabs. His unerring eye picked out Hotet. The examining magistrate in charge of the case. Pleased to meet you, le judge. This is a terrible business. How's Mrs. Renaud? Is she bearing up fairly well? It must have been an awful shock to her. Terrible, terrible, said Hotet. Permit me to introduce Bex, our commissary of police, Gerard of the Sûreté. This gentleman is Hercule Poirot. Mr. Renaud sent for him, but but he arrived too late to do anything to avert the tragedy. A friend of Poirot's, Captain Hastings. Stoner looked at Poirot with some interest. Sent for you, did he? You did not know, then, that Renaud contemplated calling a detective, interposed Bex. No, I didn't, but it doesn't surprise me a bit. Why? Because the old man was rattled. I don't know what it was all about. He didn't confide in me. We weren't on those terms, but rattled he was, and badly. Said Hotet. But you have no notion of the cause? That's what I said, sir. You will pardon me, Stoner, but we must begin with a few formalities. Your name? Gabrielle Stoner. And how long ago is it that you became secretary to Renaud? About 2 years ago, when he first arrived from South America. I met him through a mutual friend, and he offered me the post. A thundering good boss he was, too. Did he talk to you much about his life in South America? Yes, a bit. Do you know if he was ever in Santiago? Several times, I believe. He never mentioned any special incident that occurred there? Sorry. Anything that might have provoked some vendetta against him? Never. Did he speak of any secret that he had acquired whilst sojourning there? No. Did he ever say anything at all about a secret? Not that I can remember, but for all that there was a mystery about him. I've never heard him speak of his boyhood, for instance, or of any incident prior to his arrival in South America. He was French-Canadian by birth, I believe, but I've never heard him speak of life in Canada. He could shut up like a clam if he liked. So far as you know, he had no enemies, and you can give us no clue as to any secret to obtain possession of which he might have been murdered. That's so. Stoner, have you heard the name Duveen in connection with Renaud? Duveen. He tried the name over thoughtfully. I don't think I have, and yet it seems familiar. Do you know a lady, a friend of Renaud's, whose Christian name is Bella? Again, this could just be a nickname. Again, Stoner shook his head. Bella Duveen, is that the full name? I'm curious. I'm sure I know it, but for the moment I can't remember in what connection. The magistrate coughed. You understand, Stoner, that the case is like this. There must be no reservations. Sorry, it was italicized. You might perhaps, through a feeling of consideration for Madame Renaud, for whom I gather you have great esteem and affection, you might... Enfin, said Hotet, getting rather tied up in his sentence. There must absolutely be no reservations. Stoner stared at him, a dawning light of comprehension in his eyes. I don't quite get you, he said gently. Where does Mrs. Renaud come in? I have immense respect and affection for that lady. She is a very wonderful and unusual type, but I don't see how my reservations or otherwise could affect her. Not if this Bella Duveen should prove to have been something more than a friend to her husband. Ah, said Stoner, I get you now. But I'll bet my bottom dollar you're wrong. The old man never so much looked at a petticoat. He just adored his own wife. They were the most devoted couple I know. Hotet shook his head gently. Stoner, we've absolute proof. A love letter written by this Bella to Renaud, accusing him of having tired of her. Moreover, we have further proof that, at the time of his death, he was carrying on an intrigue with a Frenchwoman, Madame Dubril, who rents the adjoining villa. And this is the man who, according to you, never looked at a petticoat? The secretary's eyes narrowed. Hold on, le Judge. You're barking up the wrong tree. I knew Paul Renaud. What you've been saying is utterly impossible. There's some other explanation. The magistrate shrugged his shoulders. What other explanation could there be? What leads you to think it was a love affair? Madame Dubril was in the habit of visiting him here in the evenings. Also, since Renaud came to Villa Genevieve, Madame Dubril has paid large sums of money to the bank in notes. In all, the amount totals some 4,000 pounds of your English money. I guess that's right, said Stoner quietly. I transmitted him those sums at his request, but it wasn't an intrigue. Eh, mon Dieu! What else could it be? Blackmail, said Stoner sharply, bringing down his hand to slam the table. That's what it was. Ah, voilà une idée! Cried the magistrate, shaken in spite of himself. Blackmail, repeated Stoner. The old man was being bled, and at a good rate, too. 4,000 in a couple of months. Whew! I told you just now there was a mystery about Renaud. Evidently, this Madame Dubril knew enough of it to put the screws on. It is possible, the commissary cried excitedly. Decidedly, it is possible. Possible, roared Stoner. It's certain. Tell me, have you asked Mrs. Renaud about this love affair stunt of yours? No, monsieur, we do not wish to occasion her any distress if it could reasonably be avoided. Distress? Why, she'd laugh in your face. I tell you, she and Renaud were a couple in 100. Ah, that reminds me of another point, said Hotet. Did Renaud take you into his confidence at all as to the dispositions of his will? I know all about it. Took it to the lawyer for him after he'd drawn it out. I can give you the name of his solicitors if you want to see it. They've got it there, quite simple, half in trust to his wife for her lifetime, the other half to his son. A few legacies. I rather think he left me 1,000. When was this will drawn up? Oh, about a year and a half ago. Would it surprise you very much, Stoner, to hear that Renaud had made another will less than a fortnight ago? Stoner was obviously very much surprised. I had no idea of it. What's it like? The whole of his vast fortune is left unreservedly to his wife. There is no mention of his son. Mr. Stoner gave vent to a prolonged whistle. I call that rather rough on the lad. His mother adores him, of course, but to the world at large it looks rather like a want of confidence on his father's part. It will be rather galling to his pride. Still, it all goes to prove what I told you, that Renaud and his wife were on first-rate terms. Quite so, said Hotet. It's possible that we shall have to revise our ideas on several points. We have, of course, cabled to Santiago and are expecting a reply from there any minute. In all possibility, everything will then be perfectly clear and straightforward. On the other hand, if your suggestion of blackmail is true, Madame Dubril ought to be able to give us valuable information. Poirot interjected a remark. Mr. Stoner, the English chauffeur Masters, has he been long with Renaud? Over a year? Have you any idea whether he has ever been in South America? I'm quite sure he hasn't. Before coming to Mr. Renaud, he had been for many years with some people in Gloucestershire, who I know well. In fact, you can answer for him as being above suspicion. Absolutely. Poirot seemed somewhat crestfallen. Meanwhile, the magistrate had summoned Marchand. My compliments to Madame Renaud, and I should be glad to speak to her for a few minutes. Beg her not to disturb herself. I will wait upon her upstairs. Marchand saluted and disappeared. Sorry, that was my saluting and disappearing. He waited some minutes, and then, to our surprise, the door opened, and Mrs. Renaud, deathly pale in her heavy mourning, entered the room. Hotet brought forward a chair, uttering vigorous protestations, and she thanked him with a smile. Stoner was holding one hand of hers in his with an eloquent sympathy. Words evidently failed him. Mrs. Renaud turned to Hotet. You wish to ask me something, le Juge? With your permission, madame, I understand your husband was a French-Canadian by birth. Can you tell me anything of his youth or upbringing? She shook her head. My husband was always very reticent about himself, monsieur. He came from the northwest, I know, but I fancy that he had an unhappy childhood, for he never cared to speak of that time. Our life was lived entirely in the present and the future. Was there any mystery in his past life? Mrs. Renaud smiled a little and shook her head. Nothing so romantic, I am sure, le juge. Hotet also smiled. True, we must not permit ourselves to get melodramatic. There is one more thing. He hesitated. Stoner broke in impetuously. They've got an extraordinary idea in their heads that Mrs. Renaud. They actually fancy that Mr. Renaud was carrying on an intrigue with Madame de Brille, who it seems lives next door. The scarlet color flamed into Mrs. Renaud's cheeks. She flung her head up and bit her lip, her face quivering. Stoner stood looking at her in astonishment, but Bex leaned forward and said gently, We regret to cause you pain, madame, but have you any reason to believe that Madame de Brille was your husband's mistress? With a sob of anguish, Mrs. Renaud buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved convulsively. At last she lifted her head and said brokenly, She may have been. Never in all my life have I seen anything to equal the blank amazement on Stoner's face. He was thoroughly taken aback. End of chapter 10.